the girl slowly took off her clothes, getting ready to start her work. However, she didn't expect that. A man restrained the girl's limbs with iron chains. He also put a gag on the girl's mouth. The man was a deranged serial killer. The girl's name was Zoya. She was only 14 years old. While she possessed a special ability, whenever she read reports or news about homicides, she could reconstruct the crime scenes where the killer had struck. What was even more shocking was that, in profile writing, she could even envision the location where the killer disposed of the bodies. One time, while chatting with her friend, she had a premonition that one of her classmates was about to be murdered. The girl's name was Zoya. Due to her unique ability, as Zoya grew up, she became a criminal profiler. Soon, she gained some recognition in the local community. Whenever the police encounter a difficult puzzle, they would seek her help. On this day, Zoya arrived at the police station as scheduled to complete her analysis work. She narrowed down the list of over 200 suspects to just a dozen or so. Soon, Zoya quickly gained fame in the police world with her abilities. On this day, the chief encountered a case that the killer had turned the victim into a human specimen and placed it in a bustling area. The chief called for Zoya, seeking her assistance in solving the case. Witnessing the killer's methods, Zoya became determined. She felt that engaging in a battle of wits with the killer was a pleasure. Her mind raced at this moment, to the extent that on her way back home, she was still pondering the criminal's methods. As she entered the apartment elevator, she noticed a masked man in black, staring at her from the opposite side. Zoya tightened her grip on the self-defense pepper spray in her hand, afraid that the man might suddenly lunge at her. Luckily, the elevator doors finally opened. She then rushed back home. Zoya, upon returning home, had dinner with her roommate. She recalled the case she had encountered earlier in the day. She began pondering the details of the case. She started discussing it out loud. Her roommate had become accustomed to it. At that moment, Zoya suddenly frowsy. She often entered her own profile world like this, without any warning. In her meditative world, Zoya made herself the victim of the crime, enabling her to experience the killer's methods more vividly. Zoya woke up with a lingering fear. Right at that moment, her roommate handed her an anonymous package. Zoya opened it and looked inside, only to find a man's necktie, and it appeared to have been used. But it seems that Zoya is no longer surprised by the situation. She opened her drawer. Inside were several neatly arranged, nearly identical anonymous packages. The next day, Zoya, who had a dreamless night, as usual, Zoya went out for a morning run. While running, Zoya sensed something was off. There was a man dressed in black, who was following her closely. He maintained a distance from her. Zoya quickened her pace upon noticing the pursuer, but the man in black matched her speed. Soon, Zoya found herself unable to run any further. She stopped in her tracks and picked up a large stone from the roadside, preparing to defend herself in case the man attacked. She was ready to fight back. Right at that moment, the footsteps of the man grew closer and closer. Zoya took a deep breath, raised the stone, and turned towards the man, but the man seemed startled by her actions. He cursed and ran away. It turned out she had mistaken someone else. Zoya also felt a bit embarrassed. Was she being too sensitive? In the evening, Zoya couldn't sleep. Memories from her childhood flashed before her eyes. She had a sense of unease. It felt like everything was somehow connected to her. Zoya got up, took out the necktie that had been sent to her, and wrapped it around her neck. She wanted to experience, in some way, the mindset of the killer during the crime. She gave it a strong pull, and suddenly, she felt like she was experiencing a near-death sensation caused by strangulation. Witnessed the process of the killer committing the crime, even saw the true face of the killer. But right at that moment, the ringing of the phone interrupted her. When Zoya answered, the other person remained silent. There was a low, heavy breathing sound on the other end of the phone. Inside a dimly lit room, a man dressed in York leaned over, pouring a glass of red wine for the girl. He then picked up a piece of food and brought it to the girl's mouth. But at this very moment, the girl was terrified. She had no appetite to eat. The scene was eerie, blending with the soft music in the room, emanating a chilling and eerie atmosphere. The girl's limbs were bound with ropes, rendering her unable to move. But right at that moment, York walked out of the room. He revealed his whereabouts to the girl, believing that the girl would never escape. The girl saw a glimmer of hope for escape. She struggled to roll her body, using the flame of a candle to burn through the ropes that bound her. However, she accidentally fell to the ground. The noise she made caught York's attention. Just as the girl was preparing to escape, she was suddenly grabbed from behind by York, choking her, the man who had appeared gentle and caring just moments ago. At this moment, It was as if possessed by a murderous spirit. Son, the girl fell silent. The next day, the police found the girl's body by a riverbank. What surprised the investigators at the scene was that this marked the beginning of a serial killer spree. In the evening, on the bustling streets of St. Petersburg, several girls stood by the roadside, heavily made up, and with seductive postures. A man rubbed his nose and called out to one of them through the car window. She was a girl who worked alone, picking up customers. Little did she know that she was about to face a great danger, as this man was a deranged serial killer. The man was in the process of embalming the girl's body, arranging her in a peculiar pose, creating an extremely eerie sight. He had turned his acts of murder into his own artistic masterpieces. Several days later, the police found the girl's body on a bridge. Faced with such a deranged serial killer, the police called in criminal profiler Zoya, and also brought in Special Operations Agent Mike to assist in the investigation. The chief demanded that Mike report the progress of the investigation to him at all times. At that moment, Mike was chatting with his grandfather. Upon hearing the news, he decided to search online for information about Zoya. His grandfather, who was behind him, said, "She doesn't seem like an ordinary girl." Mike drove to the St. Petersburg police station and participated in the team meeting regarding the case. The first victim was an art student. Because the killer had embalmed the body, the police couldn't determine the exact time of death for the student. Based on the blackened left foot of the deceased, the doctor concluded that the time of death was at least 5 days ago. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The second victim was tied to the railing of a bridge. The cause of death was the same as the previous victim, yet this victim had a decayed mark on her leg. Based on the color of the body, the forensic doctor believed that the killer had used different embalming agents in these two cases, but there was no DNA evidence of the killer on the bodies. What's worse, the surveillance footage of the crime scenes was all missing. The police brought in a criminal psychologist. The doctor narrowed down the list of suspects, but as Mike looked at the doctor in front of him, he felt that the person lacked experience. Mike decided to wait until the criminal profiler Zoya arrived before making any conclusions. 14-year-old Zoya was aware of her ability to reconstruct crime scenes and had a great interest in all the homicides. On this day, after witnessing a series of similar murder cases, she believed that it was a serial killer acting alone. At this moment, Zoya was aware that after committing such crimes, it was highly likely for the killer to revisit the crime scenes, relishing the pleasure of own actions. To verify this hypothesis, Zoya rode her bicycle alone to the riverside, utilizing her abilities and confirming that it was indeed the crime scene. Satisfied, she prepared to return home, but suddenly she noticed a figure behind a large tree. Zoya thought it must be her nerves acting up again, so she didn't pay much attention to it. At that moment, a familiar voice sounded from behind her. It turned out to be Lance, a friend from the local bike repair shop. Just as Zoya was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she noticed that Lance's expression seemed different. When faced with her inquiries, he couldn't provide an answer. After returning home, Zoya believed that Lance had a secret, but she was unwilling to believe that her friend could be a murderer. Zoya couldn't fall asleep no matter what, and she didn't know how much time had passed. Zoya once again entered the crime scene in her mind, but this time, it was on an empty street with no one around. Then Zoya noticed that a black-clad man had appeared behind her. Unnoticed, he was staring at her from across the road. She immediately quickened her pace, trying to shake off the pursuer, but the man started chasing her, so Zoya started running as fast as she could. But soon her energy began to wane. She could hear the footsteps of the man getting closer and closer. Zoya gave up on escaping, but when she looked back, there was only an empty street behind her. Just when she let her guard down, a pair of large hands covered Zoya's mouth and nose from behind and dragged her into a small grove of trees. Then her shirt was torn open. It was at that moment that Zoya woke up in a fright. It turned out to be a nightmare. She thought to herself, she must see a psychologist during the day. She suspected she might be experiencing a mental illness. She was on a plane heading to St. Petersburg. After shooing away the man next to her, the plane landed on the runway. Mike and Zoya greeted each other. Then they began discussing the expert they met in the morning. Zoya had researched about the expert online. She wanted to see the expertise of this specialist. During the convened meeting for analyzing the clues, Zoya had experienced the nonsense abilities of this expert. The expert stated that the killer was an embalming expert, most likely someone working in a funeral home or a doctor. Zoya felt embarrassed for him after hearing that. she publicly asked the expert to explain the black and left foot on the body. She stated, "The killer's embalming technique is that of a beginner with basic knowledge." Then, Zoya further expressed, "It's experts like you who make solving cases difficult for the police." Just as the expert was preparing to argue, the police received another report of a third body. Time was precious. Zoya hurried to the scene with Mike. The forensic examiner determined that the cause of death was the same as the previous cases, strangulation. After embalming the body, the killer dumped it by the seaside, arranging the body to appear as if in thought. Zoya noticed that the victim had a ring on hand, but the previous victims didn't have any jewelry. Based on the sunburn marks on the body's skin, Zoya believed it was highly likely that the victim was a sex worker. Such individuals are often targeted by killers, so Zoya decided to visit a funeral home. After a round of praising, the funeral home owner was very willing to assist her. Zoya found an answer to the decay on the second victim's leg. It turns out, the killer's embalming technique was inadequate, resulting in that mistake. More importantly, embalmers usually sew the mouth closed for aesthetic reasons before embalming, but this particular body had its mouth open. Through the explanation of the embalmer, Zoya gained some understanding of the killer's psychological profile. Zoya, based on the clues provided by the police chief, quickly located the roommate of the last victim, so she, along with the police chief and Mike, began the investigation. The deceased had no history of drug use. She was friendly and had a good social circle. While she had never worn a ring, nor had she ever worn the clothes found on her when discovered. At this point, the case reached a deadlock. During the night, Zoya tried to sort out her thoughts. She entered the crime scene. Zoya believed that the killer must have disguised himself before committing the crime. Just then, Zoya received an email on her phone. She opened it. Surprisingly, it was a video sent by the expert she had mocked before. The video utilized face-swapping technology. It pranked her by transforming her into a woman acting drunk. The video contained many sensitive remarks. Zoya recalled the small town she had lived in during her childhood. At that time, the town had experienced a series of serial killings. Zoya often fantasized about being a victim. In order to understand the killer's criminal psychology and relying on her abilities, she foresaw the death of her classmate. She utilized her abilities to catch a glimpse of the suspect at her classmate's funeral, and the suspect's characteristics closely resembled someone she knew. It was none other than Lance, her friend from the auto repair shop who had a crush on her. Lance cared deeply about her. He even left the keys to his house at her place. What further raised suspicions was that in the scenes she profiled previously, Lance had appeared at the scenes of the murders. Zoya shared all of this with her mother, but her mother didn't believe her at all. Given the recent string of heinous crimes, her mother simply instructed Zoya to stay at home and not go out. Frustrated by her mother's disbelief, Zoya decided to investigate on her own. She went to Lance's house, sneaking in quietly. After searching around, Zoya didn't find anything related to the crimes. Just as Zoya was about to leave, she discovered women's clothing under the bed. In the home of a single young man, why would there be women's clothing? Zoya also found a strange shoebox, and upon opening it, she was shocked to find multiple blood-stained pieces of women's underwear. Zoya was deeply shocked. Right at that moment, she heard the sound of the door opening downstairs. Lance had returned. Zoya quickly put everything back in place, and she prepared to head downstairs. She wanted to slip out of the door, but she was almost caught by Lance. Zoya had no choice but to sneak back into the bedroom, planning to hide on the balcony for a while. However, she noticed Lance holding a cup of coffee. He was standing in the yard beneath the balcony. Taking advantage of Lance turning his head, Zoya quickly climbed onto the roof, sliding down a water pipe and reaching the ground. She thought she was safe. Just as Zoya was about to leave, she was spotted by Lance as he was leaving. Zoya had to stop in her tracks, but luckily she was already outside the house. She quickly came up with an excuse, and fortunately a familiar neighbor passed by. Zoya followed the neighbor back home. After this incident, the unsolved mysteries from her childhood often flashed through Zoya's mind. Considering the current serial killer, who bore many eerie similarities to the unsolved serial murders from her childhood, Zoya couldn't help but find it strange. While the difference now from before was that the recent victims were dumped in different locations and had undergone preservation treatment, what puzzled her even more was that the deceased were wearing clothes that didn't belong to them and were posed in some kind of bizarre positions. But why would the killer do such a thing? This question became a knot in Zoya's heart. On that day, the police chief handed Zoya a file. The information in the file is related to the animal department. In the past 2 to 3 years, the local authorities have received 27 reports of preserved animals. What's even more bizarre is that all the animals have been arranged in special poses. This is good news for Zoya, as the killer might be using these animals for preservation experiments and practice, because the police wouldn't pay much attention to these animals. Later on, while having a meal together, Zoya started her own profile writing again, but what surprised her was that, this time, she was actually in bed with Mike. She couldn't worry about that at the moment. After analyzing the situation together, Zoya deduced that the killer would strike again within 3 days. She believed the next victim could still be a prostitute, but what puzzled her was why the first victim was a student. Zoya decided to go with Mike and visit the deceased's friend to gather more information. The friend of the victim stated that the victim had a boyfriend before, and now the friend's current boyfriend is the ex-boyfriend of the victim. Subsequently, Zoya and Mike also learned that the victim was planning to move before the incident because the previous landlord was a villain. After learning this chaotic information, Zoya began to suspect the relationship between the deceased and the current couple. In the evening, Zoya, finally, from thousands of people, selected the next potential target of the killer. Immediately, she instructed her assistant to call them one by one. What Zoya didn't know was that this action was already too late. Meanwhile, on the other side, in the nightfall of St. Petersburg, a young and charming girl caught the attention of a man in a car. This girl perfectly matched the killer's gray criteria, between 19 and 25 years old, no tattoos or piercings, and she was standing alone on the street soliciting business. Such a girl was the perfect target in the killer's mind. At the killer's home, the girl was about to undress to start her pleasurable work, but the man revealed a knife, threatening the girl, chaining her limbs with iron chains, and placing a mask on her mouth. Just as the man was preparing to enter the studio to mix his preservation solution, he realized that the ingredients were completely gone. He took off his protective suit and drove out to buy the ingredients. In the man's momentary absence, the girl's phone started ringing. Driven by a strong survival instinct, the girl kept twisting her body and astonishingly managed to reach her phone on the ground. The call was from Zoya's assistant, yet the girl couldn't speak at that moment. She could only make sounds through her throat into the phone. Time is precious. Mike, beside the assistant, realized that something was wrong. He quickly thought of a plan. Suddenly, he started speaking out the letters of the kidnapping one by one. The girl only needed to respond, but just as they reached the 4th letter, the killer returned from outside. Witnessing this scene, the killer became very angry. The phone call only echoed the girl's desperate screams. On the other side, the police couldn't pinpoint the killer's location. They first sealed off the relevant roads. At this moment, the killer was nearing madness. As he didn't have time to preserve the body, he moved the girl's body. On the road section blocked by the police, a man drove a medium-sized truck, and the police requested to inspect the truck's trunk. They only found some leaking liquid. The driver came up with an excuse, and surprisingly, the patrol officers let the man go. Zoya also brushed past the killer. Seeing that her target was not there, Zoya was puzzled. All the roads near the crime scene were already sealed off. So where did the victim girl go? The next day, the police found the victim girl's body under the bridge. Observing the scene of the body disposal, Zoya began another profile writing. In her imagined world, she Saturday in the passenger seat of a van, and a man stood outside the vehicle. It was Lance. Could it be that the killer in the murder case and the previous serial killer were the same person? What made Zoya even more uneasy was that Lance started walking towards Zoya. Although Zoya appeared expressionless at the moment, deep down she was nervous. Just then, the person outside the car turned into Mike. Zoya calmed herself down, and she crouched down beside the deceased person, examining the characteristics of the body. What Zoya could confirm was that the serial killer was already searching for the next victim. Zoya's childhood, where she discovered items at Lance's house. She told everything to the police chief. However, the police chief expressed that there was evidence of Lance's absence, and multiple people could testify to it. Zoya was at a loss for words, but she always believed in her abilities. On that very night, to calm her frightened mother, her father asked the police about the suspect's identity. The police asked her father to keep it quiet, and to Zoya's disbelief, the name the police mentioned turned out to be a timid boy from school. Could it be because he was angry from being bullied? But why would he kill a female classmate he didn't even know? The police chief explained that this boy had been pursuing the girl, and even stalked her frequently. Since then, Zoya's parents no longer believed her statements. They just made her stay at home, not allowing her to go anywhere. One evening, the adults in the town organized a community meeting for the safety of their own families and children. Everyone went together to apprehend the criminal suspect. It was on that night, when Zoya and her sister were alone at home, when suddenly they heard the sound of the door opening. Zoya thought it was her parents returning, and she wanted to get up and check, but to her surprise, Lance was standing in the hallway. Zoya was momentarily stunned in place, but she quickly regained her composure. She hurriedly ran back to her room, locked the door, and pushed a table and a bookshelf to block the door. Zoya was very scared at that moment. Then Lance's voice came from outside the door. Lance said that he just wanted to talk to Zoya, but Zoya, of course, didn't believe him and refused to open the door no matter what. Lance had no choice but to leave. Zoya heard no more sound from outside the door. Zoya thought of getting up to see what was happening outside the door. As soon as she opened the door slightly, she was knocked down by a strong force. It turned out that Lance had left. He just wanted to wait for Zoya to let her guard down before entering. Fortunately, the table and bookshelf behind the door served as a barrier. Zoya opened the window and called for help. While all the adults in the town were out capturing the suspect, nobody could hear Zoya's cries. Fortunately, Zoya's cries caught the attention of an elderly lady. She promptly called the police. Lance could only escape. Shortly after, the town returned to its usual tranquility. The police captured the timid boy, but Lance disappeared that same night. It took away all the belongings from his house. Nobody believed that Lance could be a murderer. Everyone believed that Zoya scared Lance away. What puzzled Zoya was how Lance fabricated his alibi. Since then, Zoya started receiving envelopes containing neckties continuously. It has been ongoing until now. Zoya was highly suspicious that each necktie represented a girl's life. On the other side, at the bridge where the second victim was found, a journalist was also at the memorial site. He discovered a strange envelope. Afterwards, the journalist falsely claimed to be Zoya's fan and arranged to meet Zoya in person. To learn more about the case, he used a video made by the previous expert to threaten Zoya into cooperation. If Zoya didn't agree, he would ruin Zoya's reputation. In fact, Zoya didn't need to think. She already knew that there must be another necktie in the envelope. Afterwards, Zoya attended the police's case analysis meeting. Everyone complained about the continuous investigation and interviews. It was simply torturous. So, the police chief asked Zoya how the profiling was going, while Zoya simply stated that she had only completed a rough profiling. The police chief expressed dissatisfaction and ended the meeting. In the evening, Zoya was drinking in her apartment. She intended to relax with Mike, but when she thought about the gruesome state of the victims, she abandoned the idea. Just then, Mike knocked on her door. He brought dinner and beer. The two of them drowned their sorrows in alcohol. The next day, Zoya accessed the police station's archives and retrieved all the murder records from previous years. Surprisingly, she made a discovery. A 21-year-old victim had also been strangled, and until now, the police hadn't caught the killer. Afterwards, Zoya discovered that the victims in the case were dismembered, and there were no DNA samples on their bodies. Zoya thought, if this case is connected to the recent series of murders done by the same person, the killer is likely to begin attempting preservation techniques after this case. With a direction for the investigation, Zoya went to a pipe company and found the fiancé of the 21-year-old female victim. After learning about the situation, Zoya left a photo of Lance behind. She then went to the first victim's friend's house, where the girl was drinking. Zoya also left a photo behind. Later, she met with the previous journalist. Finally, Zoya arrived at a beach, which was the same place where, during her childhood, her female classmate's body had been dumped after the murder. Standing by the seaside, Zoya seemed to see Lance riding a bike with that girl. They arrived at the beach, passionately embracing and kissing each other. But soon after, Lance unexpectedly took out a necktie and strangled the female classmate. Zoya didn't want to watch anymore. She turned her head, only to see Lance standing behind her. Zoya realized this wasn't the profile world she had imagined. Lance had returned. Zoya ran as fast as she could, but Lance caught up with her and knocked her down. Zoya struggled desperately, trying to escape Lance's clutches, but Lance pinned Zoya down, rendering her unable to move. Then he took out a black necktie, preparing to strangle Zoya. Sensing her life was in danger, Zoya grabbed a stone and smashed it towards Lance's head. Lance fell to the ground. Just as Zoya was about to counterattack, she was stabbed in the shoulder by Lance. Zoya pulled out the knife and forcefully stabbed it into Lance's thigh. Both of them were seriously injured at this point. Realizing he couldn't defeat Zoya, Lance covered his leg and walked away, leaving Zoya lying on the ground. She was terrified by what had just happened. Zoya was quickly discovered by someone and taken to the hospital, but even so, Zoya was not willing to sit idle. She was quickly thinking, trying to find clues from this incident. Outside the operating room, after learning that Zoya was fine, Mike, who came rushing over, also relaxed. Mike recalled his past, when during a mission a few years ago, he became too emotional. He shot and killed a suspect on the spot. After subsequent investigations, it was found that the person who was killed wasn't the real culprit. As a result, he transitioned from being a police officer to an investigator. Just then, the police chief arrived at the hospital. It turned out that Zoya was rescued, thanks to the taxi driver. Shortly after Zoya got out of the car, saw a man getting out of a car by the seaside, and assumed it was a secret date between lovers. The driver didn't think much of it, but soon he saw the man escaping. He got out of the car to assess the situation. Mike explained to the police chief that this Lance was from the small town where Zoya grew up, and a suspect in a serial murder case. The police chief was puzzled. Feeling deceived, he granted Mike and Zoya a long vacation, but what no one expected was that, during their vacation, significant progress was made in the case. After being discharged from the hospital, Zoya received comfort and care from her friends. Meanwhile, Mike became very interested in the thing that Zoya analyzed the cases when she was young. The truth about the tie in the envelope finally came to light. She received a total of 11 envelopes, 14 ties. The first tie was handed over to the police by Zoya back then. Later, when collaborating with other organizations, Zoya handed the second tie to the investigator, but the other person asked her to first address her mental issues. Zoya was very angry. She burned the third tie that was sent to her. Every tie received afterward was preserved. Zoya had the ties analyzed for fingerprints and other forensic evidence. However, there were no conclusive results. In subsequent letters, sketches of Zoya being violated were enclosed. All of this made Zoya feel frightened because of the serial murders in her hometown during her childhood, which caused nobody to believe her words. Lance always had an alibi during each incident. Even Zoya's father could testify for him. Analyzing these events, Zoya believed that there might be more than one perpetrator. It's also possible that Lance cleverly escaped after committing the crimes and then returned later. But how does this relate to the recent cases of preserved female corpses? Mike said, Lance must have seen Zoya's videos online, yet someone else might be responsible for the preservation of the bodies. Mike believed that maybe Zoya's intuition was mistaken this time. Seeing Zoya's contemptuous expression, Mike no longer argued and picked up his folder and left. Mike headed to the small town where Zoya lived as a child. After conversing with the local police chief, he finally understood the cause of the incident. It turns out that, after the forensic examination at that time, it was determined that the female classmate's time of death was between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. The suspect was in the library until 4 p.m., but the girl had already gone missing at 2 p.m. The police chief believed at that time that during the time the girl was missing, she was probably on a date with her boyfriend, and just as she was about to return home, she tragically fell victim to foul play. Mike expressed his confusion. Why wasn't the victim's boyfriend mentioned in the case file? Subsequently, Mike noticed something odd in the forensic report. Since the body was discovered on the same day, why was the report signed 2 days later? What happened during that period? The police chief stated that everyone was focused on catching the killer at that time and didn't pay much attention to these details. Mike didn't waste any words. He found the forensic examiner from that time, and he asked, why was the initial estimate for the time of death 2 p.m., but later changed to between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., and it was precisely because of this that the timid boy ended up committing suicide in prison. His parents demanded an explanation from the forensic examiner, proving the innocence of their son, but the forensic examiner stated Mike needed to think clearly about the situation in their country. Mike finally understood. Mike went to Zoya's house and apologized to her, explaining what had happened. It turned out that the police wanted to convict the timid boy, so they persuaded the forensic examiner to alter the time in the examination report. Zoya's previous reasoning was correct. There was indeed another person involved in the killings. The two of them tore down all the clues and photos on the wall, heading straight to St. Petersburg. In the car, They discussed the killer's career and motives for the murders. They discovered that the victims started as students and later became women wearing wedding rings. It was as if the killer was recreating the life of a girl. From childhood to adulthood, the killer wanted to thoroughly clean the victims, perform embalming, and dress them in brand new clothes, proving his meticulous attention to every step. These clothes fit perfectly, not because the victims had great figures, but because the killer most likely took the victims to the supermarket. Just like Zoya's reasoning, the killer's target was a single mother. He looked at the family inside the house and began to fantasize about turning them into dolls later, reading bedtime stories to the two children, and having dinner with the hostess. Zoya and Mike both understood that they didn't have much time left. The two of them searched all the malls, but found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Zoya noticed a mannequin in a shop window, wearing the same outfit as the beach victim. With encouragement from Zoya and Mike, the shop owner remembered some details. She said there was indeed a man who would often stare at that outfit from outside the window. The two immediately searched for surveillance footage and finally found the suspect's figure. Unfortunately, the killer deliberately avoided being captured by any surveillance cameras. Mike was not willing to give up. He continued the investigation, and finally, in the parking lot surveillance footage, he found the killer's car. Mike, with the help of the technical staff at the police station, obtained the address of the car owner. It was a wooden house, and the homeowner was not pressed. The neighbors informed Mike and Zoya that the female homeowner had passed away 2 months ago. She cursed her ex-husband every day, smoking and drinking all day. Her daughter died of lung cancer at the age of 13. What's even more surprising is that once the hostess was drunk, she had her two sons feed the deceased sister, saying their sister was just sleeping. Later on, one of the two brothers cut off ties with their mother and left. The other one started working as a plumber, but the neighbors were too old and couldn't remember the names of the two brothers. They only remembered one of them as Mick. Upon hearing this name, Zoya immediately thought of someone, the 21-year-old woman who was murdered 3 years ago. Her fiancé had that name, so Zoya could almost infer that Mick was the killer, because a friend of the first victim mentioned that the killer had repaired the victim's plumbing, and the physical characteristics of the suspect and the surveillance footage were also extremely similar to that fiancé. Meanwhile, the two also recalled the girl who called for help on the phone. When Mike asked, "Who kidnapped you?" the word she tried hard to say was van. When Zoya had previously visited Mick's company, she saw minivans used for transportation, but there was one thing that didn't make sense. Mick claimed to have a bad back when moving boxes, so how could he carry and transport bodies? Moreover, the deceased was his fiancé. Now they only have one option. Only Mick's brother is left. When Mick learned that his brother might be the killer of his fiancé, he immediately rushed forward and grabbed Mike by the collar. Zoya suspected that Mick's brother and sister-in-law had some secrets. Coincidentally, the brother also had a key to their house. Meanwhile, Mike also reminded them that recently the victims likely came from the plumbing company's customer list. So, they searched the customer list of the company. The name of a single mother appeared before them. Their guess was correct. Inside a county apartment, the hostess opened the door to welcome a plumbing inspector inside. Just as the hostess was signing, the inspector approached behind the woman. He grabbed the woman's neck, but he didn't expect the hostess to have a ballpoint pen in her hand. She stabbed the man's arm with it. The pain caused the man to scream. The woman picked up her son. Just as she was about to go save her daughter, she noticed that the man was already holding the girl and standing at the door, staring at her. Meanwhile, Mike and Zoya arrived downstairs at the apartment building. He instructed Zoya to wait for the police to arrive. Mike climbed over the wall. He saw two children locked to the radiator. So, he sneaked into the house, but he was discovered by the killer. The killer held the hostess hostage with a knife. Mike had no choice but to put down his gun, although he wanted to negotiate with the killer. The killer's emotions were extremely unstable. This further angered him. Zoya downstairs heard the commotion and hurried over. The killer noticed there was another person. He threatened to kill the hostess, but what happened next made Mike highly appreciate Zoya. Zoya, in order to prove she didn't have any weapons, took off her jacket, and she expressed her willingness to switch places with the hostess to become the hostage herself. Seeing the hesitation in the killer's eyes, Zoya took off her pants as well. Mike immediately understood what was happening. Zoya had a handgun concealed behind her. Taking advantage of the moment when the killer released the hostess, Mike shot and knocked the killer down. Later, Zoya became a celebrity in the news industry. Various publishing houses wanted to report on Zoya's story. Mike was also promoted within the police department. Their relationship grew deeper as well. On that day, Sawyer received another envelope. Inside was a tie and a photo of a friend with Lance. The first season of the TV series, A Killer's Mind, concluded with this. The plot of this series is tight and reasonable. The mysteries set up earlier are explained later on. The relationships and interactions between the characters are very interesting. Yet, the almost perverse serial killer's methods also make people reflect on human nature and social conditions. This is a work worth watching. If you like my channel, please subscribe to it.